Arkansas, 1875. The land was wide and untamed, a stretch of forests, swamps, and farmland where survival often depended on grit and faith. Out here, communities lived in silence, broken only by the sound of wind through the trees or the crackle of lantern light at dusk. Yet in one small settlement, the silence gave way to whispers, whispers that grew into terror. People began to speak of a man, a farmer, a father, a neighbor, who claimed he had heard the voice of God. But what followed was no divine miracle. Instead, it was something darker, something that would stain the soil with fear. This is the story of the Arkansas man who committed acts so unspeakable that his name was nearly erased from the record, buried under folklore and horror. Yet the echoes remain, carried like a curse through generations. The tale of the cannibal who said God commanded him. At first, he appeared ordinary. His life was not much different from others in rural Arkansas during the Reconstruction era, where poverty, faith, and superstition shaped every household. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, though prone to long, wandering sermons he delivered to no one in particular. Sometimes, when working in the fields, he would stop suddenly, gaze upward, and mutter words as though in conversation with the sky. For a time, people dismissed it as the harmless eccentricities of a man touched too deeply by the scriptures. But soon the muttering grew into proclamations, and the proclamations into commands. Orders, he claimed, came directly from God's mouth. The line between faith and madness is often razor thin. In this man's mind, the voice of God demanded sacrifice, not of animals, not of offerings, but of flesh, human flesh. The horror began quietly, shrouded in secrecy. He claimed a vision had told him that salvation required him to partake of the flesh of the chosen. He spoke of ancient rituals, of biblical echoes that twisted the meaning of sacrifice into something monstrous. Those who encountered him during this time remembered his eyes, wide, fevered, burning with conviction. To him, this was not sin. It was obedience. Word of the first disappearance spread quickly. A drifter, someone with no ties to the community, vanished after being seen in his company. The town grew uneasy, but it was a time when strangers often came and went, swallowed by the hardships of the frontier. No one asked too many questions. But then came the second, a young farmhand whose family lived nearby. His absence could not be ignored. Whispers began to circle, whispers of screams in the night, of strange odors drifting from the man's property, of tools found stained and hastily hidden. The community that had once thought him merely eccentric began to fear him. Some avoided his path entirely, walking miles out of their way rather than pass by his farmhouse. Others tried to confront him, only to be met with sermons so unsettling that their words failed. He spoke of divine hunger, of cleansing fire, of a commandment no one else could hear. And all the while, families locked their doors at night, afraid that they might be the next to vanish. The horror of his acts was not just in the violence, but in the justification. To hear him tell it, these were not crimes, they were offerings. He believed that by consuming flesh, he was fulfilling a divine pact, ensuring his salvation and the salvation of the world around him. He claimed he had been chosen, that others were blind to the truth. His conviction was so complete that it became difficult to tell whether he was a murderer wearing the mask of religion, or a man entirely consumed by delusion, trapped in the echo chamber of his own mind. Those who later spoke of him, neighbors, lawmen, even ministers, could never shake the sense that he truly believed what he said. That perhaps was the most chilling part. He did not kill in secrecy, racked with guilt. He killed with the calm certainty of one obeying orders from heaven. And when he spoke of it, his voice was soft, measured, even gentle, as though explaining the simplest truth in the world. The story of this man, the Arkansas cannibal who believed God commanded his acts, has been buried in folklore and shadows. But in those days it was raw, terrifying reality. Families kept their children close. Churches prayed fervently for protection. And still, behind one farmhouse's closed doors, the unthinkable continued. When his crimes finally came to light, they shattered the community. People struggled to reconcile the man they once knew with the monster revealed in whispers and fragments. The press seized the tale, amplifying it until it spread far beyond Arkansas, turning him into a symbol of the thin, fragile boundary between faith and madness. Yet even as newspapers sensationalized, Those who lived through it knew the truth was far worse than print could capture. This is not a tale of blood for shock's sake. It is a story about belief twisted into horror, about how desperation and isolation can warp the human mind, and about the haunting line between the sacred and the profane. It is about fear that lingers not in screams but in silence, the kind of silence that falls when a community realizes it cannot explain what it has seen. So as we look back into the year 1875, into the dim corners of Arkansas history, we must ask, was this man a prophet gone mad, or a madman cloaked in prophecy? Did he truly hear the voice of God, or was he simply hearing the echo of his own darkness? Whatever the answer, his tale has become part of America's forgotten folklore, a chilling reminder of how easily faith can become terror. And tonight we reopen that silence. To understand how a man in 1875 Arkansas could come to believe that God commanded him to commit an act as horrifying as cannibalism, we must first step into the world he lived in. The late 19th century was a time of upheaval, healing, and desperation in the American South. Arkansas, once a frontier state filled with promise, had by then been carved into small towns and farms, many of which struggled to recover from the devastation of the Civil War and the turbulent years of Reconstruction that followed. Life in rural Arkansas during this era was defined by hardship. Roads were little more than dirt tracks, often impassable in the rainy season. Families lived miles apart, sometimes separated by dense forests, swamps, or rivers that cut them off from neighbors. The isolation could be crushing. For many, church gatherings or the occasional trip to a market town were the only opportunities to see beyond the boundaries of their homestead. It was a world where survival came first, and faith, whether in God, in family, or in the rhythms of the land, was the tether that kept people anchored. Religion permeated every aspect of life. After the Civil War, communities across the South clung tightly to their churches, not only for spiritual comfort, but as centers of social and cultural identity. In Arkansas, Baptist and Methodist congregations dominated, preaching fiery sermons that emphasized sin, punishment, and redemption. For many, the Bible was not just a book, but a lens through which every event in their lives was interpreted. Drought, disease, or misfortune were seen as signs of divine judgment. A good harvest, a healthy child, or a sudden stroke of luck could be celebrated as God's mercy. At the same time, superstition thrived. Folk beliefs, passed down through generations, blended with Christian teachings. In the backwoods and swamps, tales of curses, omens, and spirits circulated as freely as Scripture. It was not unusual for people to consult both the preacher and the local folk healer when sickness struck. For the poor, who had little access to doctors or formal medicine, the invisible world, whether holy or haunted, was just as real as the physical one. Economically, Arkansas in the 1870s was fragile. The war had destroyed infrastructure and left scars both physical and psychological. Plantations were broken up and small farmers fought to sustain themselves on thin plots of land. Sharecropping and tenant farming became widespread, locking many into cycles of poverty. Hunger was a constant threat. It was not uncommon for families to go days with little more than cornbread and salted pork, and when harvests failed, entire communities teetered on the edge of starvation. In such conditions, desperation could warp the mind. Malnutrition and poor health made bodies weak and minds vulnerable. Without modern psychiatry, mental illness was often misdiagnosed as moral failure, demonic possession, or divine punishment. A man muttering to himself in the fields might be called eccentric at first, but as his behavior worsened, neighbors might whisper of madness or of visions. Some might shun him, others might believe him chosen, and still others might simply ignore him, too busy surviving their own struggles. It is in this climate that the man at the center of our story lived. His small farmhouse stood on the edge of a swampy wood, the land both fertile and treacherous. He was not wealthy, nor particularly well known, but like many men of his time, he carried a deep and fiery belief in God. In his mind, the Bible was not allegory, but living truth, every word a command to be obeyed. Alone on his land, with little to keep him grounded in the wider world, his faith began to bend under the weight of his isolation. There were precedents for men like him. Throughout American history, individuals claiming divine visions had appeared, especially in times of social upheaval. Some founded new religious sects, drawing followers with promises of salvation. Others wandered alone, dismissed as madmen or shunned until their stories faded. But in Arkansas, in the aftermath of war and hunger, the line between prophet and lunatic was especially thin. A man claiming God's voice might be feared, or he might be followed, depending on what he said and how he lived. Arkansas itself was a land of contradictions. Its cities, like Little Rock, were trying to modernize, bringing railroads, commerce, and industry. Yet vast stretches of the state remained wilderness, where families lived much as their ancestors had a century earlier. In these rural pockets, law enforcement was sparse, communication slow, and newspapers often arrived weeks late. A crime could go unnoticed for months, even years, if it occurred in the right shadowed corner. It is no coincidence that so many of America's darker stories, murders, disappearances, whispered horrors, emerged from these isolated rural places. Isolation breeds silence, and silence can conceal much. When neighbors began whispering about the Arkansas farmer who claimed God's voice, it was not immediately clear how to respond. Was he simply another eccentric, like so many who roamed the backwoods muttering scripture? Or was there something more dangerous lurking beneath his words? The cultural landscape of the 1870s also played a role. This was the era of the Second Great Awakening's lingering influence, when emotional preaching and personal visions of God were not only accepted but sometimes celebrated. Tent revivals traveled through Arkansas, bringing fiery orators who warned of hellfire and promised salvation. In this atmosphere, the idea of hearing God's voice was not outlandish. Many believed God spoke directly to individuals through dreams, signs, or inner voices. What made the difference was the nature of the message and the man who received it. Against this backdrop, the Arkansas Cannibal's story becomes more than just a tale of horror. It is a window into a time when hunger gnawed at bellies, faith saturated every thought, and madness could wear the mask of prophecy. His conviction that God commanded him would not have seemed utterly impossible in his cultural setting. Instead, it would have struck people as deeply unsettling, a terrifying perversion of a belief they themselves cherished. In the larger context of American history, cases like his expose the fragile boundary between faith and fanaticism, between community and isolation, between survival and collapse. The 1870s were years when America was trying to rebuild, to stitch together the wounds of war. But in small rural towns, the scars were fresh and the shadows long. A man like him, isolated, devout, and increasingly unhinged, was not just a lone monster. He was a product of his time, his culture, and the silent, punishing land that shaped him. And so, when we examine his tale, we must do more than recoil from the horror of his acts. We must see the world that made them possible, a world where hunger and poverty pressed hard against human decency, where the Bible's words could become a hammer instead of a guide, and where silence allowed darkness to thrive unchecked. Arkansas in 1875 was fertile soil not only for crops but for fear, and in that soil something unspeakable took root. The story of the Arkansas farmer begins not with violence, but with whispers. Neighbors had long noted his solitary habits, his tendency to retreat deep into the woods for hours at a time, returning with wild eyes and a voice trembling with fervor. He spoke of visions, of a light that descended between the trees, of a command so powerful it rattled the very marrow of his bones. At first, the community tolerated his behavior. Eccentricity was not unusual in the backwoods, and men who muttered scripture were often regarded with a mix of pity and caution. But something in his voice carried urgency, an edge of dread, as though the message he bore was not for himself alone, but for everyone around him. The first incident came one autumn evening, when his wife, weary from another day of toil, failed to appear at Sunday service. The congregation asked questions, but he answered only with cryptic phrases. "She has been taken into the Lord's plan," he said, his face pale, his eyes darting as if seeing something beyond their sight. Days stretched into weeks, and still she was absent. When pressed, he murmured about sacrifice, about Abraham lifting the knife against Isaac, and about a God who required proof of devotion. The neighbors withdrew, uneasy but unwilling to intrude. In those days, family matters were considered private, and interfering could invite more trouble than it was worth. Then came the discovery of bones near the edge of his land. They were small, charred fragments, buried shallow in the soil. Hunters stumbled upon them and brought word to town. At first, it was thought they might belong to an animal, perhaps a hog or a deer. But when the local doctor examined them, his face darkened. These were not the bones of livestock. They were unmistakably human, and not whole bones, but shattered pieces, broken as if by deliberate force. The whispers swelled into accusations, though none dared speak them directly to the man himself. The farmer, meanwhile, seemed to sink deeper into his delusions. Witnesses claimed they heard him at night, his voice rising in chants, calling into the darkness. He spoke not only to God, but as if God himself spoke back, booming through his mouth in words that made little sense to others. He carried a hatchet with him at all times, the blade rusted, the handle worn smooth by his grip. Some swore they saw stains upon it, dark patches that no amount of washing seemed to remove. One chilling evening, a young boy from a nearby homestead wandered too close to the farmer's property. The child's screams echoed through the trees, and by the time his father arrived, the boy was bloodied but alive, shaken and rambling about the man's hands grabbing him, about words shouted of purification and the Lord's feast. The farmer denied the assault, claiming the boy had trespassed and tripped. The law was called, but in that era, sheriffs were few and far between, and proof was hard to come by. The incident was recorded, whispered, then quietly buried beneath the community's reluctance to provoke further danger. But the violence could not remain hidden forever. One winter's morning, smoke rose thick from his chimney, carrying with it a stench so foul it clung to the air for miles. Neighbors approached, drawn by morbid curiosity, and what they found shook them to their core. Inside, the hearth blazed, and upon the flames rested not logs alone, but pieces of flesh, their edges blackened, their scent unmistakable. The man stood beside the fire, muttering prayers, his face gaunt, his eyes alight with a fervor that bordered on madness. He did not flee when confronted. Instead, he spread his arms wide, as if welcoming them into his secret. "It was God's command," he declared. "The body is but dust. The spirit is his. I am but the instrument." Panic swept through the room. Some wanted to strike him down then and there to end the nightmare before it spread further. Others, paralyzed by fear, retreated into silence. In those tense moments, the farmer seemed less like a man than a figure possessed, his voice carrying an eerie calm that unsettled all who heard it. He spoke of angels who demanded blood, of visions in which he was shown the path to righteousness through fire and flesh. The law eventually intervened, though only after more reports surfaced, travelers gone missing near his property, bones unearthed in shallow graves, scraps of clothing found tangled in the underbrush. When authorities arrived, they found his home littered with remnants, jars filled with unidentifiable scraps preserved in brine, tools stained with rust and darker substances, and journals scrawled with verses twisted into commands. His arrest was not a struggle. He went quietly, almost peacefully, repeating over and over that he had obeyed the voice of the Almighty. The trial that followed was a spectacle, drawing crowds from across the county. The evidence was grotesque, the testimonies chilling. Doctors spoke of the bones, the flesh, the clear signs of cannibalism. Neighbors recounted the screams, the smoke, the stench that had haunted them for months. The farmer, however, never faltered in his explanation. To every accusation, he offered the same refrain: it was God's will. His calmness unsettled even the hardest men, for he seemed genuinely convinced that his actions were righteous, not criminal. And yet beneath the horror, questions lingered. Was he merely a murderer cloaked in religion, using God as a shield for his crimes? Or was he truly delusional, his mind fractured by isolation, hunger, and faith stretched beyond reason? In 1875, psychiatry was in its infancy, and few could separate madness from evil. To the townspeople, it mattered little. What mattered was that he had crossed a boundary too terrible to ignore. When the verdict came, it was swift: guilty. Yet even as he awaited his fate, he seemed unbothered. Some jailers claimed he prayed constantly, his voice steady, his hands clasped in devotion. Others whispered that he smiled at night, as though comforted by unseen company. Whether prophet or madman, he left a scar upon Arkansas that would not fade. His story passed from one generation to the next, stripped of details but heavy with dread, until it became less history than legend, a cautionary tale of how faith, twisted and starved, can lead even the most ordinary man into darkness unthinkable. When news of the Arkansas farmer's crime spread, the community did not erupt in chaos all at once. Instead, it was as if a slow sickness settled over the county, creeping from household to household. People spoke in hushed tones, avoiding his name as though uttering it might invite some dark presence into their own lives. Neighbors who had once greeted him at church or seen him at market could not reconcile the man they thought they knew with the figure described in court: a cannibal, a murderer, a man who claimed to serve God through flesh and fire. Families reacted first with disbelief. It was easier to call the rumors exaggerations than to face the truth. After all, this was a time when gossip often outpaced facts, and many assumed the grisly details had been embroidered by fearful tongues. But when the trial records confirmed what had been found, the bones, the flesh, the journals, denial gave way to dread. Parents clutched their children closer, warning them not to stray into the woods. Farmers began carrying rifles, not only for hunting but for protection, as if the land itself had been tainted by his presence. Religious leaders were among the first to speak publicly. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of false prophets and the devil's influence. Some argued that the man had never truly known God, that he had been a wolf in sheep's clothing from the beginning. Others warned that his case was evidence of what happened when faith was practiced in isolation, without the guidance of a community to keep one another accountable. A few even suggested that his madness was a form of possession, a punishment visited upon the community for sins unacknowledged. Congregations filled their pews not out of devotion alone, but from fear that absence from church might mark them as vulnerable to the same dark forces. Doctors, on the other hand, offered a different explanation. Though psychiatry was still in its infancy, some medical men speculated that the farmer had suffered from what they called religious mania, a condition in which obsession with scripture and visions overtook the mind. They pointed to his journals, where Bible verses were scribbled and rearranged into distorted commands. They noted his gaunt figure, suggesting malnutrition might have worsened his state. To them, his crimes were not divine but pathological, the result of a starving body and a mind consumed by illness. Yet their words carried little comfort, for if madness could twist faith so completely, then no one was truly safe. The newspapers seized on the story with morbid fascination. Headlines painted him as a monster, the Arkansas Cannibal, a name that lingered long after his trial ended. Reporters described the stench of his cabin, the horror of the evidence, the eerie calm with which he confessed. To a nation hungry for sensational stories in the post-Civil War years, this case provided both shock and caution. Yet behind the lurid details, there was an undercurrent of unease. What did it mean that such a man could exist in their midst, unnoticed until it was too late? For his family, those who survived him, the shame was unbearable. His relatives became pariahs, whispered about in markets and shunned in churches. Some changed their names and moved westward, hoping to escape the shadow he had cast. Others stayed, enduring the silent stares of neighbors who never let them forget. Children who bore his blood grew up under suspicion, as though madness or sin might be inherited. In small communities where lineage defined identity, their connection to him was a stain that no passage of time could erase. Psychologists today might interpret the community's response as a form of collective trauma. In a society already struggling with poverty and uncertainty, the revelation of his crimes threatened their fragile sense of order. People relied on faith, family, and community to keep chaos at bay, and the idea that one of their own had defied those bonds shook them to the core. They responded by tightening boundaries, attending church more faithfully, policing one another's behavior, reinforcing strict moral codes. It was a way of assuring themselves that what had happened was an anomaly, not a reflection of who they were. Yet even as the community tried to heal, fear lingered. The woods where he had lived grew infamous, avoided by hunters and travelers alike. His cabin, once dismantled, was said to leave a scar on the earth itself. Some claimed the soil there refused to yield crops, as if scorched by the evil done upon it. Others swore that strange sounds, chanting, whispers, the crackle of phantom flames, still drifted from that place on moonless nights. Whether true or imagined, these tales kept his memory alive, not as a man, but as a warning. The community's silence in the face of early signs became part of the tragedy's reflection. Many admitted privately that they had noticed his decline, his mutterings, his absences, his strange explanations for his wife's disappearance, but they had looked away. In the 1870s, privacy was sacred, and interfering in another's household was unthinkable unless violence spilled into the open. This reluctance became a source of guilt, though rarely spoken aloud. People asked themselves whether lives might have been spared if someone had intervened sooner. Even decades later, when the story had become legend more than history, older residents spoke of it with unease. They warned their children against straying too far from the community, against listening to voices that called them into the dark. They told the tale as both cautionary and supernatural, blending fact with rumor until it became impossible to separate the two. Was he a madman, a murderer, or a man possessed? The answer mattered less than the lesson, that isolation, hunger, and unchecked fervor could open doors better left closed. The reaction of society as a whole was layered, fearful, judgmental, curious, and self-protective. The case revealed the limits of law, the fragility of faith, and the power of rumor in shaping collective memory. It showed how quickly a community could rally together in condemnation, but also how quietly it could turn away when early warnings arose. And it left behind not only scarred families, but a region haunted by the knowledge that evil, cloaked in righteousness, had once walked among them. The night of his final act began like any other, with silence so deep the crickets dared not sing. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the smell of pine and rot. Inside the farmer's cabin, a single lantern flickered, casting shadows that writhed across the walls. On the rough-hewn table lay his Bible, its pages warped from sweat and blood. His hands shook as he traced the words, rearranging them into commands that only he could hear. The last sacrifice, he told himself, would be the one to seal his covenant. God, or the voice that wore his name, had promised him forgiveness, eternal life, and power beyond the reach of ordinary men. He believed the fires of heaven waited for him, but to pass through them he needed flesh, warm and trembling, placed upon the altar of his hearth. That evening, a neighbor had come to check on him, bringing a sack of dried beans and flour. She was one of the few who still pitied him, still thought his strange ways were nothing more than grief. He welcomed her in with a smile, his eyes bright in a way that unsettled her. She noticed the smell first, coppery, like blood left too long in the sun. Then she saw the stains on his apron, dark patches that had soaked through the fabric. Before she could speak, he closed the door behind her. The bolt slid into place with a sound that echoed in her bones. She tried to laugh, to ask if he had been butchering livestock, but his reply was a whisper. "Tonight," he said, "the Lord feasts." Her scream never carried beyond the cabin walls. Neighbors later told of hearing strange sounds that night, the crackle of fire, the low rumble of chanting, the rhythm of something heavy striking wood. Some swore they smelled burning meat on the wind, though no one dared approach until morning. The farmer's cabin had always felt unwelcoming, but that night it became a fortress of dread, every window glowing with the pulsing light of flame. Inside, the ritual unfolded with a precision born of madness. He laid the woman across the table, binding her hands with rough cord. He prayed aloud, voice breaking into sobs and laughter, as he raised the knife. In his mind, angels leaned close, eager to receive the offering. He imagined trumpets, the gates of heaven creaking open. What the woman saw instead was a gaunt man, trembling and wild-eyed, consumed by voices only he could hear. When the blade fell, it was not clean. His hand wavered, striking bone, tearing flesh. The room filled with screams, hers and his alike, as if both were being consumed in the same fire. He carved clumsily, reverently, setting aside portions as though arranging a feast. Each cut was punctuated with prayer, each act of violence disguised as devotion. The flames of the hearth roared higher, fed by fat and blood. He believed the fire had accepted his gift. The shadows around him seemed to swell and dance, no longer bound to the walls. Sweat poured down his face as he knelt before the blaze, holding aloft what he claimed was the holiest part of the body. His voice rose in triumph. "Behold, O Lord, your servant obeys." But the fire offered no answer. Instead, silence filled the cabin. Silence so deep it pressed on his chest and rang in his ears. He waited for a sign, a voice, a vision. None came. His triumph curdled into doubt. Had he misunderstood? Had he failed? He stared at the blood soaking the floorboards, the broken body on the table. The grotesque meal he had prepared, and for the first time, the enormity of what he had done struck him. Then came the knock at the door. A group of men from the village, uneasy from the night's strange sights and smells, had gathered their courage. With lanterns and rifles, they stood outside, calling his name. He froze, the knife still in his hand. The voices of the angels returned, urging him to finish what he started. "One more," they hissed. One more for the fire, but the door gave way under the weight of men determined to see what had become of their neighbor. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The heat struck first, thick with the stench of burning flesh. Then their lanterns revealed the scene, the table slick with blood, the woman's lifeless body, and the farmer kneeling before the fire like a priest before his altar. His face was smeared red, his eyes wide and feverish. For a moment, no one moved. The men could not comprehend what they were seeing. Then he rose, the knife gleaming in his grip. The struggle that followed was chaos. The men shouted, some dropped their lanterns, others fired blindly. The farmer lunged with unnatural strength, his blade catching one man across the arm before another struck him with the butt of a rifle. He fell but did not stop fighting, writhing and clawing like a man possessed. It took 4 men to pin him to the ground, their boots pressed into his arms and chest as he screamed prayers and curses all at once. They dragged him from the cabin, his body thrashing, his mouth foaming with spit and blood. Even as they bound his hands, he raved about angels, about fire, about how they had interrupted God's final command. Some men argued he should be shot on the spot, put down like a rabid animal. Others insisted he stand trial, that justice, not vengeance, must be done. Behind them, the cabin burned. One of the dropped lanterns had ignited the blood-soaked floorboards, and the flames spread quickly. None dared go back inside to salvage what remained. They stood in the yard, watching the roof collapse, listening to the roar of fire devour the last traces of his altar. Some said the flames shrieked like a woman's voice. Others swore they saw shapes moving within the smoke, too large and too twisted to be human. By dawn, nothing remained of the cabin but ash and scorched timbers. The farmer sat in chains, hollow-eyed and silent. His madness burned away with his shrine. But for the community, the horror had only just begun. The memory of that night, the screams, the smell, the things glimpsed in firelight, would live in them forever. That was the climax of the Arkansas Cannibal's tale. The night devotion turned to slaughter. The night neighbors discovered what had been festering in the dark. And the night a whole community understood that evil can wear the face of a man they thought they knew. Morning broke over the smoldering ruins of the cabin, and with it came a silence more unsettling than the chaos of the night before. The farmer, now shackled and hollow-eyed, sat under guard in the town's small jail. His mouth no longer spilled sermons or curses, yet the silence that replaced his ravings carried a different kind of terror. He stared at the walls as though he could still see angels whispering to him through the cracks. Some said he had gone deaf to human voices, but could still hear only God. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire across Arkansas. Newspapers printed lurid accounts, some embellishing the tale into near myth. The headlines varied. Arkansas Cannibal, the mad prophet of flesh, a man who ate for God, each one feeding a growing public fascination. Ministers preached fiery sermons about the dangers of false prophecy. Doctors debated whether the man was insane, epileptic, or possessed by religious mania. Neighbors who had once shared meals and prayers with him now crossed themselves at the mention of his name. Yet for all the explanations offered, none fully answered the haunting question: why? In the courtroom, the trial unfolded with grim spectacle. Witnesses described the smell, the blood, the grotesque sight of the farmer kneeling before his hearth. The surviving men who subdued him recounted their struggle in halting words, their voices breaking as they remembered the shrieks and the fire. Some fainted while testifying. Others wept openly. The farmer, for his part, remained disturbingly calm. He admitted everything without shame. "I did as commanded," he told the court, his voice low but steady. "The Lord demanded his feast. Who are you to question him?" No plea of insanity softened the blow of his words. Doctors examined him, some insisting he was delusional, others declaring him fully aware of his crimes. The jury deliberated briefly, returning with the only verdict the public would accept: guilty. His sentence was death by hanging, but even that judgment did not end the whispers. On the morning of his execution, the gallows was crowded with spectators. Men, women, even children gathered, eager or perhaps compelled to see the man whose hunger had become legend. He was led out in chains, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When asked for last words, he did not beg for forgiveness or curse his captors. Instead, he raised his face to the sky and said, "The fire is not quenched. The feast is not ended. I will return." The trapdoor fell, the rope snapped tight, and his body jerked once, then stilled. Some swore they heard laughter in the crowd. Others claimed they heard a woman's scream carried on the wind, though no woman had cried out. His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside town, the soil quickly reclaiming the secret. Yet, as the years passed, strange tales persisted. Travelers claimed to hear chanting near the site of the burned cabin. Hunters spoke of smelling charred meat in the forest without any fire in sight. Children dared each other to visit the spot and returned pale, swearing they had seen a figure kneeling in the ash. Even respectable townsfolk admitted in hushed tones that the memory of the farmer seemed to linger, restless, as if death had not ended his covenant. Historians now look back on the case as a collision of poverty, isolation, and religious extremism in post-Civil War Arkansas. Some suggest he suffered from schizophrenia, hearing voices that convinced him of divine missions. Others point to starvation and desperation, conditions that warp a man's mind until he can no longer distinguish survival from salvation. In that sense, his madness was not entirely his own, but born of a society that left him adrift in hunger and grief. Still, the epilogue of his story refuses to settle neatly into diagnosis or explanation. The facts are recorded, yes, the arrest, the trial, the execution. But the deeper questions, what he believed he saw, what he thought he heard, whether he truly felt the hand of God pressing him toward horror, remain unanswered. Perhaps they always will. The legacy of the Arkansas cannibal is less about his crime than about the shadow it casts. It is a reminder of how fragile the boundary is between faith and delusion, how quickly conviction can become destruction. It forces us to ask, what would we do if the voice we trusted most demanded the unthinkable? Would we recognize it as madness, or would we obey? And so his story lingers like smoke long after the fire has gone out, a dark parable of devotion twisted into atrocity. In the silence of Arkansas nights, when the wind rustles the trees and the air grows heavy with unseen weight, some say you can still hear the whisper he left behind. Not words of repentance, but a warning carried on the breath of the past. The feast is not ended.